It turns out that my journey has been about learning how to trust. Trust so much riskier than religion. Religion just gives you a set of rules, tells you what you're supposed to do, and then you just try to do it. Trust? That's way scarier, and I didn't trust anybody, and you can understand why. So, let me tell you what happened. I'd spent 11 years in the reconstruction of the shack, trying to figure out how to put my world back together in participation with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 2005 flips over, and a surprise happens. Joy shows up as a constant companion. Now, I didn't even know that was possible. I hadn't prayed for it. I didn't even know you could pray for it. And suddenly joy is a constant companion. And this is 2005. 2004, we'd lost everything, at least materially. And now joy shows up as a constant companion. I didn't tell anybody because I was afraid like the other shoe was going to drop. Joy had never spent the night. And now a constant companion. Well, 6 months into this, I'm having a little conversation with a friend of mine named Thad, and he's an artist, and I love conversations with artists because they tend to see things quite differently, and it's helpful. And I'm at breakfast, and it's like I'm here, Thad's here, and Joy is sitting next to me, and I'm going like, hey, Thad. And I tell him that joy has become a constant companion, and I don't understand why. And Thad asks the obvious question. So what changed at the beginning of this year? And I think about it for a second and it dawns on me. 2005, I finally started to live inside the grace of just one day. And it was such a natural progression and step for me that I hadn't realized what an impact that little step in the sequence was going to make. I want to read to you a little bit out of chapter 1 of The Shack. There is something joyful about storms that interrupt routine. Snow or freezing rain suddenly releases you from expectations, performance demands, and the tyranny of appointments and schedules. And unlike illness, it's largely a corporate rather than an individual experience. One can almost hear a unified sigh rise from the nearby city and surrounding countryside where nature has intervened to give respite to the weary humans slogging it out within her purview. All those affected this way are united by a mutual excuse, and the heart is suddenly and unexpectedly a little giddy. There will be no apologies needed for not showing up to some commitment or other. Everyone understands and shares in this singular justification, and the sudden alleviation of the pressure to produce makes the heart merry. Even commonplace activities become extraordinary. Routine choices become adventures and are often experienced with a sense of heightened clarity. We're dominated by expectations. They rule us, and we get a little break from them. Oftentimes we have a sense of joy. We have the pressure that's alleviated. You see, I've spent most of my life as a future tripper. That's the term that I coined for it. You know, creating imaginations that don't exist, mostly fear-based. It's all about the future and what's going to go wrong. I mean, all my kids and the diseases that they might have, or How many times have I been to my own funeral and I was the only one who cried? How many situations, those conversations I'm going to have with that person, and then they're going to get mad and they're going to go a different direction, and it hasn't even happened. Future tripping. And I decided I was done with that. Somehow, in the sequence of events, I wasn't in need of control anymore. When you deal with fear, you either can choose to trust or control. Did you know that the word believe should be translated most of the time for us, in the West especially, as trust? We talk about believing in God. Well, that seems to be a thing we do in our heads. It's an intellectual assent to a set of propositions or something. Trust, that's a whole person response that puts ourselves into the hands of someone else. Trust is a very different thing. And suddenly, when I decided to stay inside the grace of just one day, joy became a constant companion. Why? And I wrote about this, and I said, I read Joy's blog, and Joy wrote, finally, Paul has become a constant companion rather than an occasional acquaintance. Here's what I was doing. I was taking today's grace, and we only get grace for one day. Sufficient to the day is the grace thereof. And I was spending today's grace on things that don't even exist. Imaginations. Take every empty imagination that raises itself up against the knowing of God. Take it captive, right? Future tripping. And I'd stopped future tripping. I decided to stay inside the grace of one day. And guess what? That was the mark that I had finally become a child. Not childish. I'd finally become childlike. I didn't have a memory of being a child. I never had been one. Children, they naturally trust until someone teaches them that it's dangerous. They live inside the grace of the day. They don't have a 5-year plan or an agenda. I mean, I've got my calendar now, but if something goes sideways, I start looking for the adventure. I start looking to see what's going on. And I have grace, one day at a time. Childlikeness, that is the life of the kingdom. To learn how to just settle in. When you're facing stuff and our draw is into future tripping, take it captive. Say, I'm not going there. I'm staying inside today. All of that, it's imagination. You know what? I don't even know if I'm going to be alive by tomorrow. Some cell could go sideways in my head in the middle of the night. Some truck could come across the middle of the road, and it's all she wrote. It's imagination. It's not even real, and I'm spending real grace on things that don't exist. And what would it cost me to let go of that control? Well, it's the risk of trust. I've learned so much from my grandbabies. You know, I'm a much better grandfather than I ever was a father, but that's because I've grown and changed, and I've learned to become a child. Children are present. They're here, and guess what? In the present, there is fullness of joy, and joy became a constant companion. Three little wonderful stories, childlikeness. We have an adopted granddaughter. Our son and daughter-in-law adopted her from Uganda. She came out of a very difficult background, a child of incest. And her name is Maisie, which means longed for child. It took a long time for them to get Maisie out of Uganda. And while our son and daughter-in-law were over there, going through all the red tape and bureaucracy, the children that are siblings to Maisie were staying at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Elle was about 5, maybe almost 6 at the time, and we were driving along in the car one day, and Elle says, "Hey, Gramps, after Maisie's been here for a while, will she turn white?" I said, "No." She said, "You mean she's always going to be brown?" I said, "Yeah." Elle thinks about it for a second and then says, "Good. This family needs more brown babies." Simplicity of a child, the wonder of childlikeness. One day, our oldest grandson, who was talking to his dad, says to him, "Hey, Dad, do you think Jesus ever made mistakes?" And our son says, "Well, what do you think? A lot of smart people have wondered about that." And he thinks about it for a second and he says, "Yep, I think he made mistakes, because how else could he have learned anything?" We have this imagination about the humanity of Jesus as if he cried on cue as a baby or pooped when it was only appropriate. Jesus is a human being. You know, there's a reason maybe that he never tells parables about being a carpenter. Maybe he wasn't very good at it. I mean, there was no big thing about, you gotta go to Nazareth. There's this guy that makes like perfect doors. So he's a human being. He got mistakes wrong on his math tests, and this little child understands that. I'm thrilled that he already knows that it's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes aren't sin. It's part of being human. How else are you going to learn anything? Last little story, and this is just kind of a wonder story. My family, my parents, my sister, my brother, they all live up in British Columbia. And I was up visiting them, and we were in a circle of friends. And there was a guy there who's a doctor from South Africa who had migrated into Canada and had a practice in British Columbia, up where my folks live. And he told us this story. In his journey from South Africa, he'd had an encounter with Jesus, but he was very new. And he knew that praying was a good idea, and didn't understand that it's simply a conversation, right? You have a conversation and you listen, and you talk and you listen. It's just like knowing any person. And but he thought, you know, that it was more of a religious kind of thing, but he really wanted to pray for his patients. Now, he's an oncologist and dealt with people in the last stages of death and dying. And so when it was appropriate, nobody was around, he would go in and he would pray for his patient. Most of the time they were in coma. And he said he wasn't very good at it and didn't know exactly what he was saying. But he'd go and do this. There was one particular elderly lady. Obviously, she was close to death. Her respirations were down about 2 a minute, and it was close. And he was way past his end of shift. And he went in there anyway to see if he could just pray with her before she slipped through the thin place. And her family had already gathered around her, and so she wasn't available. And he closed the curtain, turned his back, and in a quiet voice said what he thought was appropriate. "Dear God, bless her as she steps through and into your embrace." And then he walked back to the nurse's station and signed out. He said, "Let me take her papers and I'll sign them. You just put in TOD, time of death." And great, and he goes home. Next morning, he comes back to the hospital and he's doing his rounds, and he looks in expecting to see that that room is empty, and she's sitting up in bed. And when she spots him, she does this. And he walks over to her and she says, "Son, that was the worst prayer I've ever heard. So I asked God if I could stay an extra day and teach you how to pray." And she did. It was either the next day or the day after that she passed away. But this doctor says with tears in his eyes, "She taught me how to pray." The wonder of children who live inside the grace of one day, who live in a world of expectancy. This is the kingdom. This is what we're drawn to and attracted to when it comes to the life of a child. This is a world that is yet to be explored and discovered inside the grace of just one day. I think children and grandchildren teach us a lot about staying in the presence of joy, and being outside of the boundaries of expectations. And then there are those people that enter our lives who are like grown-up children, and they remind us that there is nothing ordinary, that everything is extraordinary. I think it was C.S. Lewis that said, "You'll never meet an ordinary human being." One of my friends who's like that is Bob Goff. He wrote this little book called Love Does. It's beautiful and wonderful. And Bob is like 10 children wrapped up into a man's body. He is childlike. He's also a really good corporate attorney. Kind of an odd juxtaposition. He helped Uganda write their Declaration of Independence. He flies a Ugandan flag along with the American flag at his house in San Diego. And he has diplomatic immunity. Haven't we all kind of wished for diplomatic immunity? Even though we don't even know what it means most of the time. Bob likes to do things that are sort of outside the boundaries, like a child. For example, he told me one time that if I wanted to, he could make me an envoy, a diplomatic envoy. And he said the nice thing about a diplomatic envoy is that you can set up appointments with whoever you want, and they sort of have to take them. And because Bob is the counsel for the Ugandan government, he could do things like this. So he and a friend of ours named Don Miller, and you might know Donald because he wrote Blue Like Jazz and a bunch of other things that are wonderful. He and Donald decide to go visit an embassy. And Bob makes Don an envoy for the day. And they call up the Myanmar embassy. And at that time, Myanmar was one of those countries that was #1 for rights abuses. And outside of the embassy, there were picketers and police and all of this. And they called up and made an appointment. And of course, they took the appointment. So Bob and Don get there. And they're immediately escorted behind all the picketers and behind all the police and the guards and everything up to meet the ambassador. And the ambassador says, "So why did you call this meeting?" And Bob said, "I just wanted to know if you had any friends here. I just wanted to be your friend." And they were a little stunned. And they said, "So is that all?" Well, Bob said, "I was wondering, if I go to Myanmar, can I buy pizza?" Pizza? Bob says, "Well, you like pizza, right?" "Oh, we love pizza. So if I go to Myanmar, can I buy some pizza?" "No, we don't have any pizza in Myanmar." Bob said, "Okay, well, it's been great to meet you." And he and Don leave. For 30 days in a row, Bob would call up this certain pizza company and have them deliver a pizza. And it's one of those where on your little iPhone or your little smartphone, it'll tell you when they make it, when it's en route, and when they deliver it. And every time it dinged his phone and they delivered it, he would call up the embassy. "Did you get the pizza?" And by the end of 30 days, Bob was invited into their homes. He was invited into their world. And he says to me, "You know, a year later, a lot of the human rights issues changed in Myanmar. Don't have any clue whether it had anything at all to do with pizza. But relationship is everything. We are designed for relationship, and we are extraordinary. Nothing is ordinary. And the the creativity of God allows us to participate in playing like children. Would you like to be involved in something revolutionary? It's probably not what you think, but it is at the heart of prayer and transformation, and I think it's revolutionary. It'll change the world. And that's the act of contemplation. Taking a break from all the noise of the world, all the incessant demands, and listening, thinking, meditating, revolutionary. You know, we're surrounded by wonder, not just in this kind of place, which is full of wonder, but in our lives. And one of the ways that we can open our eyes is gratitude. We have so much to be thankful for. So here's what I'd like you to do. Take some time and think about the things and the people, the circumstances even, that you are grateful for. Write them down. You know, it even might be a good idea to tell them.